Yeah, nice.
Well. Here we are to expose and talk about the big bad builders, but also perhaps even the slightly besmirched council. But we'll talk about more about that later. Once again, welcome to Cladding Matters. I have with me the guy who started the whole thing off, Hamish McLay of Search Convey, who's our esteemed chairman of the board, as it were, and Steve Day, who has been running buildingsafetyscheme.org from his own place where he's stuck, dare I say it, locked in to Royal Artillery Quays, another victim of the cladding crisis. But we also have with us a very big welcome to Dominic Ahern, who is actually in another block east of the river, which is suffering from the same issues. And he's with the same, let's shall put it, discontent with the way in which it's been run so far. So welcome. But as is traditional on this channel, we're going to start up from a word from our esteemed leader, Hamish McLay.
Well, good afternoon to you all. I trust we're all enjoying some of the weather. Some of us aren't able to for a number of reasons. Our topic of conversation today does actually impact on some of those people who aren't exactly sat there in a comfortable position, because we have already had identified, as many of our listeners will know, as Steve's being able to sort of point out, Royal Artillery Quays. There are over 1,000 residents there who have impacted upon them because of the way the cladding is being handled. Now, if you like, the only reason we spent time discussing matters relative to the council, which we'll cover a little bit of that in due course, but the reason we did that is because the council themselves fell into their own pit. They dug it and then they fell into it, and they're still sat in that pit that they dug. And they don't want to climb out of it, even though they've been told numerous times by numerous people that there were failings at the time of build, at the time of all sorts of various things that are going on. Even with the cladding, which they're suggesting is going to be adequate, even that is inadequate. It is not going to impact the way it should actually impact. Now, of course, what we've got is Dominic is in a totally different sort of block, but suffering exactly the same consequences. So far, we've had identified something like 5,000 properties containing altogether 250,000 flats where remediation was going to be required. They have actually estimated that there are at least another 5,000. It could be more than that. It could be 7,000. But there's at least another 5,000. And that actually sort of means we're up to 500,000 flats that need to be remediated. Now, the sad thing is the remediation which is being carried out is not acceptable to the insurers. The insurers are saying, well, hey, hang on, you're still leaving certain materials on there. But it's the thousands that we haven't recognized yet that really are the worrying factors. They're sitting assuming themselves to be safe, only because somebody hasn't carried out the test to prove the fact. So really, the two people that we have here who have the experience of them are the ones that can tell them what has happened, what is happening. And I think the worst of it, being told, like Steve's been actually told now, that basically they have the amount of work that's going to be carried out, which is inadequate to completely sort of isolate the fire risk. That is actually going to take over 2 years, 120 weeks, and that's not going to be adequate enough for the insurers to turn around and say, okay, guys, you're safe.
Well, that seems ridiculous. I'm going to immediately pass over to Steve Day, who has been championing this very issue himself, before we move on to Dominic to hear your story, sir. Steve.
Well, yes. I mean, effectively, we're now 8 weeks in. Greenwich Council says there's no evidence of building regulation breaches at the time of construction. We've got internal reports saying the building regulation breaches at the time of construction are so serious that the prosecution should be recommended in the event of fire.
May I just interject and say, for shame, for shame.
Yeah,
Sorry.
shame on them. And we've basically done a whole campaign over the 7 weeks trying to find different ways to put it out there. And indeed, we've worked together, haven't we, Gareth, on 3 videos? And
yes.
we have another one today, which will basically socket through to that. But it's also been in the Sun. It's been in the BBC London News, their top story 2 weekends ago for 8 hours on their website. And yet this council, this Labour-run council, is still clinging to the fact that there are no building regulation breaches, ignoring their own building control department that have said that they're unlawful construction at the time. Now, down the road, as we've covered before, there's another block of flats where they threw the book at them and said they need to demolish part of it because they didn't keep to the regs. But they are not Barratt, and that's Labour's new master builder. And why is Barratt getting off down the river when up the road their competitor is they throw the book at them? That's the question. Why is the council? But they had a very bad piece of justice yesterday for them, not for us. And they lost the by-election of Shooters Hill by 108 votes because they have ignored not only the Royal Artillery Quays residents campaign, which isn't in that ward, but they were also ignoring the residents' concerns on the local issues in that area. And they were threatening people that wanted to challenge them on the doorstep and telling them to vote Labour, do the right thing, and try and bully them to the box. And it didn't work. And it's a sorry tale. But I'm very pleased we got Dom on. Dom's been a really great friend in this crisis, and he's got quite a story, of basically just how people are being ignored, very similar to how council's treating us, but at the national level, he's reached out, and it'd be great to hear what he has to say.
Well, welcome to the show, Dominic, and we'd very much like to hear your tawdry tale, if that's all right.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really know where to start, but I guess maybe the sort of how I got to meet Steve, really. But I think I kind of went down the usual channels originally, like when I had concerns that it was proposed to leave in a combustible material within our walls, and we weren't overly satisfied that our developer, or that the report commissioned looking at the external wall, we weren't 100% confident that had been done properly, and we weren't 100% sure why the fire engineer felt that they could leave in this combustible material. And then we got a rather out of the blue communication last March, just as the transitional arrangements were ending for high-risk buildings, where we were told that the developer was going to bring in the contractor to replace the decking on 4 balconies, because if they did this, then they might be able to convince the building safety regulator that they'd made a meaningful start on the building, and that they could then carry on with the remediation project as they had already scoped out, without building safety regulator scrutiny. And we felt that was not entirely honest. And at the time, I didn't realize exactly sort of how dishonest it was. But the difficulty we had is that they're kind of pushing it in terms, well, we want to get this done quickly, and if we don't try to use this tactic to push it through, then it's going to hold everything up. Whereas our concerns were, we don't believe that the original risk assessment has properly understood the risk, because there's this combustible material in the building, and you've assumed that it was installed according to its BBA certificate, and we know it wasn't, because we've seen evidence of this, and that evidence has been ignored. So by not taking into account all of the evidence and all of the way in which the building was actually constructed, they're going to arrive at a false conclusion of whether it was safe to leave in this combustible material. And we have the same issue as Steve, in that the proposed remediation doesn't satisfy the insurers. And I think it was out of frustration of going through the usual channels that I'd seen mention of Steve Day and the Earl of Lytton in the press, and I reached out to the Earl of Lytton, and he said, well, you should talk to Steve because he's been campaigning on this stuff, and that's how we got in touch, really, and realised that we had there's a lot of overlapping similarities in the various bodies and organisations that we've been in touch with, where we sort of felt that things weren't quite right.
And your combustible insulation, you mentioned the BVA certificate, Dom. That's the safety certificate that the manufacturer has to give to a product, and the builder has to install it correctly. But there are questions about the building height. Was there around that?
Yes. So I mean, this is one of the problems that we have, is that the whole through and the PAS 9980 is subjective, and so because effectively it enables the engineers to cherry pick what they look at, and in our case ignoring evidence that there wasn't a compliant install. And when I say wasn't a compliant install, these blocks, they have a non-flammable outside but a combustible core, but the way in which they need to be installed to make sure that effectively none of the combustible material is exposed, and that's all encapsulated, is quite specific on the BVA certificate in terms of all the things that need to be done, all of the materials that need to be used to make sure that it's safe. But worse than that approach not being followed, some of the panels had been installed with actual cracks with exposed combustible core in them. So my sort of big grievance with this is that although the within the PAS, the fire engineers they don't have to verify whether the building ever met historic standards or whether they meet standards now. Absolutely. However, what they seem to have done, fine, okay, I accept that point, but what they've done instead is assumed that it did. They haven't done the investigations to look at it and see if it did comply with historic, and they've made the assumptions. They've actually, in the report, it says, I'll paraphrase it, but it along the lines of assuming it's all installed correctly, then it should be fine. But we know it wasn't installed correctly, at least in one of the buildings or part of one of the buildings, and that should have then triggered sort of further investigations.
Yeah.
Now, was this with going back to the building regulations back at the time when it was built?
Yeah.
Is this breaking those regulations?
We think it probably was. I mean, partly because we've been in touch with the developer, and actually my case got raised as a whistleblowing case with them, and which apparently is unusual from a member of the public. But I phoned up they're one of the sort of big national ones listed on the stock exchange, etc. I phoned up their head office and asked to speak to the CEO. And then I got a phone call back from their head of internal audit, who then registered this as a whistleblowing case. And this was effectively raising the complaint that I don't think you should be claiming you've made a meaningful start on the project just by removing the wooden decking on 4 balconies. And this is a 258 block of flats. There's at least there's 3 buildings, and there's at least 16 balconies on each. I've just looked at photos. I think that there may be more. There's at least 16 balconies on each building. And interestingly, the government's own guidance on where on where to draw the line in terms of letting projects pass through under the transitional arrangements, they released guidance in February, where it went into quite a lot of detail about a meaningful start, or the work being sufficiently progressed as it is in the underlying legislation. They said that the intention of that was for there to be a meaningful start, i.e. some sort of something substantive, to avoid this sort of gamification of it. And it sets out in there, it should be 15% complete. And then they've released another guidance, I think it was on the 2nd of April. So just before this window was going to end, they released a further guidance, not superseding the previous guidance, but an additional guidance saying that the 15% complete, well, they didn't specify this part of it, but it says in that commencing the work is in respect of any permanent change listed in the original application or notice. So they haven't completed. So in terms of, even if they said that the balconies, replacing the decking on the balconies was listed in the original notice, which it was, they haven't completed 15% of that work in any of the buildings. So they've not only, and I've raised this point with the building safety regulator as well, and they're sort of washing their hands of it, saying, well, the developer informed the local authority building control, and they've told us that it was fine. And so the other point I wanted to make is in the recent Netflix documentary on Grenfell and the anniversary. But I mean, what sort of really frustrates me is that a lot of these condemned behaviours that have been looked into in great detail as part of the Grenfell inquiry, they're still happening now. But this time, it's the government have got their fingers in it. So the government have set out this legislation where the intention is that a meaningful start should have happened on the works. They're then getting, well, we don't know who is urging who to do it, but the developers are then going to the local authority saying, well, we've made a meaningful start, and everyone is blaming each other. So there's this as described in the Grenfell inquiry, web of blame. So we've got the developer, the local building control, MHCLG, building safety regulator, and whether MHCLG are one, and at some point they were kind of one and the same. And there's that kind of debate in terms of have MHCLG got too much influence over the building safety regulator? Certainly for all of that transitional stuff, are they influencing, going, well, we just got to push this through because we're not meeting our targets? So we've got, each party is not being honest, and they're ignoring their own legislation. And just to push forward their own targets, and I don't think that's right. So we're saying we don't want this pushed through quickly. We want this done properly, and we don't think that the process has worked. But no one is taking this seriously. Not even, I've even written to the directors of the building safety regulator, and they've said, I don't think there's anything else we can do. Everyone's ticked off their boxes, and that's recently. That's like within the last week or two. Tim Galloway wrote to me going, he's forcing me to go through the complaints process, and I'm like, well, the process hasn't worked. The fire engineer wasn't independent because they'd already written the EWS1 form and omitted evidence from it. They'd then been used to write our through, so they weren't independent because they'd already had a conflict of interest of self-review over having sort of tweaked their report in the beginning. So that's breaching the terms of the developer's remediation contract. Not only that, they're gaming the system to pretend that they made a meaningful start, to rush this all through without having properly inspected whether or not this combustible material was installed compliantly. They've said, well, we assume it was because we assume it was, but we haven't checked it. And they're confusing, everyone's confusing these points, and everyone's creating this web of blame. So this is the saddest point for me, is that the Grenfell inquiry came up with all of these findings, but they're just being ignored. Not only that, now the government have their hands in it. They're encouraging this behaviour, and I think it's deeply wrong.
Well, it is, frankly, deeply wrong. And dare I say it, Steve and Hamish, there seems to be a theme here, which is obfuscation, ignorance, gamifying the system to potentially suit some people's own undertow of purpose. We're not entirely sure what that is. And also just willful disobeying the very essence of the code with which buildings are built in the first place. And
the whole system is about ignoring what Dom is saying, what we're saying at RAAC. You've got two now, either side of the river in London, big blocks of flats, basically saying, ignore the state of the building if it was unlawful at the time of construction. Just ignore it and then shut up if you talk about it and blame everyone else and you can go off. That's after the Grenfell. And I
didn't a councillor just got effectively edged out because they happened to raise dissent?
Yeah, I would urge all the viewers of this to look at Greenwich Wire. It's our local Greenwich magazine, but it could happen in your council, wherever you are in the UK. Have a look. It's on the front page, the by-election win of the Greens, who ousted Labour. Historic win, but why? Why did Labour lose their majority? And it's a story of ignoring, belittling councillors and residents, ignoring their concerns and lying.
And not listening to residents' needs and actually fronting up to them and being truthful. I just don't understand it. It's not hard to do this stuff, really. But what I would say, Steve, and I know anyone listening who may not have heard this figure, Steve, how many domiciles are there roughly covered in the UK still with dodgy cladding that has not been remediated?
Well, so there is some figures out there. So above 18 meters, which are the high rise, there's 10,000.
Okay, 10,000
developments, not flats. Of course, it's much higher. And then between 11 meters and 18, there are numbers which I'll confirm next week because I think we need to get that accurate. But there is that 10,000 figure, and then surprisingly, no one knows below 11 meters how many blocks of flats there are, including the government. And especially not with the defects. So yeah, let's confirm that next week, the exact latest figures. And of course,
I think we could use the word many and be fairly safe. Would that be fair?
It's above 10,000 for the 11 to 18 for sure.
Do you know, in my mind, when it gets above 10,000, my mind just goes boggle because I can't even imagine it. And also, Dominic, sorry, sir, you're stuck in one. Steve is stuck in another one. If just a few of these come up, we could end up with an epidemic.
Well, it's not good for the house building program. And I think the government's plan is to limit the liability on the construction industry so they can walk away from the horrors of Grenfell. And that's why everything, including the campaign groups that are claiming to actually represent the cladding campaign, are turning on people like us that are trying to fight for solutions because they don't want solutions. They want to help the government, limit their liability and limit the builder's liability. And this is wrong. And this is why our great work here on Cladding Matters, and I do thank you, Gareth and Hamish, for your continued perseverance in this issue.
Hamish and I don't want to speak for you, sir, but Hamish and I share one thing in common. Obviously, it's not hair. And that is that we both can see when something is not being done right. Yeah. And we're both, we are champions of not just the underdog, but those who have been badly treated. And in our limited capacity, Hamish, we have to rattle our sabres. Yeah?
Absolutely. And interestingly enough, one of our podcasts earlier this week, very accomplished, both surveyor, project controller, and I don't know how many different things that Michelle has. I mean, she's even built bits and pieces herself. Never mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
truly accomplished sort of person. This actually turned around and said, "You cannot rely on building control anyway, because they do not know. They do not investigate fully what the state of a building is as it's being built."
Oh, she's told me horror stories of building control turning up and saying, "Well, it looks all right."
Yeah,
that's another couple. They know when the guys are going to come. They sit there with their cups of tea. They have a nice cup of tea. How's it going, mate? How's it going? How are the children doing? When you off on your holidays?
Yeah. Well, that's why.
Oh yeah, that's all right. Yeah, building's okay.
Yeah, that's why we need the old scheme, because it takes the onus off building control. It says you need building control because you're going to get whacked every single time if you haven't got a compliant building, and that's why we need the old scheme. Dom, you're going to say something.
This is another problem with the PAS 9980 is that effectively, and this is through. I mean, I've talked to so many different people through different channels, but some of the conversation I've had with people in building control is that they feel that their hands are tied by this. So what someone actually told me was that they're having to push through stuff that they are surprised at. The phrase I think they used was, well, they would have thought a bit more of combustibles would have come off that building. So you've got this situation where the building safety regulator, I'm saying to them, well, look, the process, the remediation plan hasn't worked because you've missed all of this. You've missed the fact that this combustible material wasn't installed compliantly. They come back and say, well, look, it's been audited by MHCLG. And my response to that is, well, they've audited what they've been presented, and they haven't been presented the stuff that was originally omitted from the report. So if you give someone something that sounds plausible and they review it, they're going to think it looks plausible. The audit is meaningless in that situation. And so that doesn't offer any reassurance. The building safety regulator are then passing it back going, well, your one's under building control because it went through on the transitional arrangements. Yeah, but you guys know, I've told you that the meaningful start wasn't made. Building control have told me that they felt misled by the developer and that we're not the only building. They literally changed the decking on 4 balconies of a 258 block of flats in March or April 2024, and they still haven't started works now. So they have not lifted a finger on any of the substantive work. And even if they did meet the guidance and say that, well, they had started the work, they hadn't even done 15% of replacing the balconies, even of that tiny part of the project. And the building safety regulator is so spineless and so toothless, and I know they know about this because I've had response from the directors, that they won't hold these people to account. If the building safety regulator won't hold people to account for breaking their own laws, then what's the point of them?
Well, this is the point. This is the point. The law needs to have teeth. Otherwise, what is the point? I mean, what's it the old adage? It's not good enough for it to be done. It needs to be seen to be done. And to be seen to be done, we need action. Now, I just want to say, because we're coming to the end of today's broadcast, and thank you so much, Dominic, for sharing that. I mean, I don't know. Maybe I'm feeling a bit punch drunk from it all, but nothing you said particularly surprised me. It upset me, certainly, but it didn't surprise me, Dominic. And we shouldn't be that. We should be surprised by bad malfeasance. But it just turns out that it's just more of the same deluge of excrement. And I think I'm going to take that as a domain name. Steve Day, thank you very much once again for standing up for those, for what is right. Hamish, for setting up this amazing channel, which I think, as everyone would agree, is the unfettered, mostly broadcastable way in which we can get people to take notice of these things. And Dominic, thank you so much for sharing your story. The other day, when the latest salvo from Greenwich, where they changed their position more times than a person with ants in their pants, it changed. Steve and I got our heads together and we thought, how could we respond to it? Well, as usual, I'm afraid we responded to it in song and word. And I hope you enjoyed the latest one, which I wrote, called Smoke and Glass, with beautiful video graphics from Steve. Here we go.
Fingers dusk in Woolwich town. Council in the corner trying to shut it down. No breach, they said with a knowing grin, while the render flakes and the fire creeps in. Signed off but not safe. His silence fills the empty space. He wrote the rules, then looked away and let the risk just sit and stay. 4 statements, 4 spins, but your own words throw stones through your own glass skin. Dot and dab bodge from day one. Now you say there's no breach. Go on, son. Spacing wrong, no fixing shown. Reports say burn, but you condone. Objectivity, that's your claim. Even hand it while you play the game.
Smoke and glass, your stories crack like brittle glass. You dug the past, but truth don't flinch, it holds you fast.
Chain failed it, Weber failed it, even your own inbox bailed it. But here you stand, smooth tie, hard stare, saying talk to the BSR like you weren't there. 418 flats and fears, hand delivered down for 2 straight years. You don't see breach, you don't see guilt. Then what the hell was even built?
Smoke and glass, your echoes never lost. You wrote the past. Now we light the match.
You can't silence truth with a council stamp. You can't whitewash facts with PR damp. The letters are yours, but the fire, that's ours to survive. Do what is right by the people you state you serve.
So I hope you enjoyed that. And I just want to thank everyone concerned and leave this with our typical sign-off. Until next week, keep your feet on the ground, keep reaching for the stars, and please try and look after that mental health. Goodbye.
There's a tale about some folks with hammers and some nails. They'll polish you the moon, but their word always fails.